Welcome to This Is Not About Your Body, where we talk about all the real shit body image issues are actually about, because they're never just about the way you look. I'm your host, Jessie Nealon, and today I have a special guest. This is Jessica Wilson, who is a dietitian, community organizer, and the author of the book, It's Always Been Ours, Rewriting the Story of Black Women's Bodies, and also co-creator of the Amplify Melanated Voices Challenge that went viral on social media in 2020. She also co-hosted a podcast called My Black Body, which changed the conversation about who has eating disorders and how treatment fails so many people, and her experiences navigating the dietetics field as a Black queer dietitian really set her apart from a lot of others in the field. And also personally, I just really love all of her work and content, and I'm really excited to have you here, Jessica. Welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah. So first up, you are a registered dietitian, which is a title that very often makes me roll my eyes immediately and prepare for a lot of cringy stuff. But I know that you are very different in a lot of your views and the work that you do. So I would love to hear a little bit about how you came to do what you do and what separates you from a lot of other RDs.
That's a great question. I was looking for a career path that was pretty stable, which is what, partially got me into dietetics. Another option I was given was nursing, and that sounded like a lot harder and like blood and gross things that I didn't want to deal with. So dietetics was another option that I was happy to join because I got to talk about food all day. And then in undergrad, I was one of maybe like 5 students of color in my program, and definitely the only Black student in the program that I was in. And then that was at UC Davis. And then at Oregon Health Sciences University, I was definitely the only Black person in there, and maybe like 2 people of color. So it wasn't until 2020 that I met another Black dietitian.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that was Whitney Trotter, and I think she's the best ever. But now I know so many because of those connections that we made. Yeah. So I got to doing the stuff that I do because I was just seeing how the field wasn't serving folks of color, how it was pathologizing, cultural diets, and, people shouldn't have, beans and tortillas, like carbs and carbs, none and oh gosh, it was bananas. And so that, and also the way it treated people at the higher end of the weight spectrum made me like 100% pivot in like what type of work I do.
Amazing. I actually want to have you talk a little bit about the pathologizing of cultural food. I think that's such an interesting topic, and not one. Well, so I came from the fitness industry. I was a personal trainer before I do what I do now. So certainly not one that I ever heard back when I was like really wrapped up in fitness, wellness, diet culture stuff. But I am now aware of, and is so fascinating to me that it just like didn't even come across my plate. Like literally this idea of, what did you say? Beans and tortillas in the same meal would be pathologized by like low carb culture. So can you give some examples of how that shows up or the kind of work you do in that space?
Yeah, one of the questions that I would get regularly when I worked in college health is like, are tacos unhealthy? Like on a regular basis? Or let's see, I had a client who was Persian and really loved Persian rice, but that was made with white rice. And she thought she should be eating quinoa, so she just didn't eat dinner.
Oh,
that was like the summary of that story. And yeah, a lot of people were saying, I only know how to cook Mexican food. I don't know how to cook, quinoa and kale. So I don't know what to do at the end of the day. The carb plus carb for sure. Over 50% of the world's population has white rice as a staple, but for some reason in the US, like we're just not supposed to eat it at all. So, also when I think of many times, for a lot of us, the like small handful of folks of color, we were always taught about what like those people ate, like what Black people ate, what, Mexican people. Yeah. And we're like in those classes, wondering what is happening here, what they ate, which is really what like I was supposed to be eating, but also not supposed to be eating. Yeah, it was a wild out of body experience.
And it also, I mean, I think it strips humanity basically from the entire process of eating, right? I mean, that is like, but it has a complete erasure of culture as like having any value to talk about food from that place, right?
Yeah. Erase it, first of all, because we're here to talk about, what is healthy according to like the Dietetic Association, which whatever that is. And it's trash and it's super fat phobic. So just forget everything you knew about what your family, is eating. And it's terrible.
So what do you say to clients in that kind of position? Like, what do you recommend, or how do you talk about it when they come in and they're like, everything I ever learned is supposed to be unhealthy now?
Right. So we usually dissect it and say, like, where did those messages come from? And not, discounting that their experience, like, is that, they have been taught that these things are, quote, unhealthy, but like, why? So the impacts of like medical racism and white supremacy on like food and food culture, and how we look at, certain foods with this like moralistic lens. And so if we strip all that away, what would you be eating, and, how would that make you feel?
Yeah, I like that. So simple at its base, but you have to like wade through all the bullshit first. I actually have kind of a funny story about this, because when I left New York City, I also left the fitness industry. So this was like sort of my first time. I was like a nomad. So I was traveling, and I lived in Thailand for 3 months at the same time that I was like basically for the first time giving up counting macros and trying to be like, whatever, structured about my food and exercise. And, for a long time after doing that, you still have the tracking mode on, like in the back of your brain, right? You're like, I know exactly how many grams of protein are in this thing, whatever. But in Thailand, I would never know what the hell I was eating. I would just get a bowl of something and I would be like, literally, I couldn't even tell you if this is like a fish, a vegetable. Like, I don't even understand what any of it is. And it's all so delicious. And it was really healing to have something that felt like I had no tracker for it. And also it was so like soul nourishing and just, oh my God, it was an amazing experience. And I wonder sometimes how much harder that would have been if I had just been living in the US, trying not to be structured around my food anymore.
Totally. That's a good point.
So something that you talk about a lot in your work is how our culture is obsessed with making, quote unquote, health an individual issue rather than like a social or systemic one. So I'm hoping to have you explain a little bit about the term, like a social construction of health, and then about how this, pattern shows up and harms people.
Sure. So, public health and medicine, we'll talk all the time about, our social determinants of health, and be able to list like 20 different things that impact, our health and well-being, our environment, food access, trauma, racism, classism, all of you, like 20 different things that actually impact whether or not we're healthy under the guise and guidelines of medicine. But when they try to talk about to us like as individuals, it's always eat less and exercise more.
Right.
The reason that you have whatever it is, you're experiencing is because you're not eating enough vegetables and because you're not exercising enough. And somehow like that's just supposed to be the miracle cure for like systemic racism, which is wild. So if we spent all that time and energy, telling people to eat less and exercise more, like what could we actually accomplish?
So in all of this social construction of health is what? Is it like the perception of what's healthy?
So I talk about health with like a capital H. And we like to think that, it just boils down to, what your lab values are, what your blood pressure is, but health looks away, health is thin, it's fit, depending on what kind of fit, depending on what decade, like if it's skinny fit, if it's, more bulky, it's fit, then okay, it's who knows, whatever it is at the time. It looks like that. It is also middle upper class. So you look like you have money. And it's just all these markers basically of like class and ease and really whiteness in our society. And size, of course, is a big piece of that. Because so if health actually meant, it was just about your like labs, blood pressure, et cetera,
Yeah.
then so many larger people would be healthy, but it's not, because health is, a social construct and it looks a certain way in our
Right.
society. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember years ago when I first saw this TED talk on like the biggest determinant or what was it? Like basically the biggest factor that can predict longevity, how long you live, was social connection.
Yep.
And again, I was like in the fitness industry and I was like, no way, that can't be it. Like there's just no way. Like it blew my mind. And since then, obviously I've learned so much more about it, and it just feels absolutely bonkers to me that we still focus on these like really zoomed in details when the research just does not bear that out as the big factors that matter.
Yeah. It's like the, people who are 95 and like doing really well, even if they're also smoking. It's because like their family and friends are around them.
Yeah. And they'll be like, oh, my secret to health is I eat a bowl of ice cream and a glass of whiskey every night. And you're like, well, but they're happy and they're low stress because they're connected, and it's all these things that actually matter. So in your experience then, especially like with clients on the higher end of the weight spectrum, what does this social construction of health do to them? Like what's the impact?
Sure. Like there's always this quote pursuit of health if you're trying to be like a well-behaved person who is larger, right? There's a really great cartoon, by Stacey Bias that goes through all of the like quote good fatty constructions. So, there's the people who are doing all the diet and exercise who also just happen to be fat. There's the fat athletes who are, only accepted because they're doing athletic pursuits. So it's really more about like the respectability of fat politics when your body just does not conform to what society finds as desirable. All these ways that people can try and, mitigate some of that fat phobia by performing, but also it just, creates eating disorders, and then eating disorders that are not diagnosed because people aren't super thin, shaming, how people view themselves means, something, if people who are larger feel fine about themselves, like they still have to go outside. So, they still have to buy clothes, sit on airplanes, all of these things. So it's just, inherently harmful for us to, look at larger folks as if they're unhealthy.
Yeah. And given the research on how dieting is one of the biggest predictors of weight gain, like the fact that all of this shaming leads to dieting, and dieting leads to eating disorders and all of these mental health issues and just so many things, plus weight gain, which now means the stigma is even higher, is like, again, I feel like people don't realize until they get into the sort of anti-diet world that this advice is absolutely backwards.
Right. Totally.
When it comes to the eating disorder field, I'm not obviously in it myself, but a lot of my clients with body image issues, they have histories of eating disorders, or they're currently like in recovery and all that kind of stuff. I see a lot firsthand of how treatment fails these people, and even more so in bodies that are not like the stereotypical eating disorder body we've been fed, which is like white, thin, young, cisgender. What is your experience on sort of seeing that play out and how it's impacted by this stigma and capital H health?
Right. I would say it is a small percentage of my clients that are thin, white, cis, straight women. Most everyone is not and doesn't see themselves, of course, as having an eating disorder. So first off, folks aren't getting assessed. They're not getting, the support that they need. One, because they don't know that what they're doing isn't, perhaps unhealthy. Two, because they're not believed. They're oftentimes, for larger folks, they're given praise, for, dieting or losing weight, when it's really part of, restriction and starvation. So having, to talk to people and introduce the concept of like eating more, especially when they're coming to me about how to eat less, that one can be really hard for some people.
So do you have people come to you who are just looking for weight loss?
Oh, all the time. All the time. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Because I guess because you work with eating disordered patients, I was imagining that like everyone was already kind of coming in with that understanding, but no. Oh,
I
wow.
might have like some magical trauma informed, cure for weight loss when, other people have been, just calories in, calories out. But, as a
Yeah.
different type of dietitian, maybe I have like a different way. I'm like, oh
Oh,
no,
wow.
no, I don't. This is, yeah, not the work that I
So how do
do.
you walk a client through that process of, I'd like to lose weight, can you help me, to all of that is bullshit that's been fed to you through oppressive systems, and also it's not healthy? Like, that's a massive shift.
Yeah. I'll typically ask about their, dieting history. As you already mentioned, there is like no diet that works.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes people have, like lost weight and regain weight. And so just talking
Yeah.
about that and, why do you think that is? Do you think that your body size is naturally perhaps larger? Let's talk about what it would mean. Um, yeah, and then what is your identity, say, if you're, not able to lose weight? Other
Mhm.
folks are already, chronically almost starving, and it's really hard, oftentimes for people who have gained like social capital from, dieting and
Yeah.
restricting to then say, like, the reason that your hair is falling out, is because you're not eating enough food, and, watching them like weigh the benefits of, like being well nourished and having their n- results like turn to like normal after starving, or,
Yeah.
giving up that social capital. And, sometimes people are not, you know, interested in finding, a way to eat more and regain lost
Yeah.
weight because it's already hard in society.
Yeah. There's so much grief work in that too, the giving up of social capital to get healthy. It's literally like, do I abandon myself or do I abandon this privilege? And it
Hmm.
is so painful.
Yeah, it's hard.
What do you see as challenges facing folks in marginalized bodies in this situation versus privileged bodies? Do you feel like they have to face different challenges throughout that journey to get to that place?
Oh, absolutely. Um, I think about it in the context of body positivity too. Um, so for, we'll say like size 10 or size 12 white women, um, being a size 8 or a size 12 is really, not going to make that much of a difference when it comes to say like a job or finding a partner, and,
Hmm.
all of these things. But, for trans folks, queer folks, black folks, brown folks, disabled people, they're like inherently less likely to get a job that they apply for. And, if there is some way to lose some weight in order to, look more desirable, the, you know, pressure can exist in that way to do so. So, the thinking ourselves into, feeling better about our bodies again, like it's possible for some folks, but, others are really exposed to, systemic and structural oppression. So yeah, it's totally different. And
Yeah.
also with trans folks and non-binary folks, restriction, can be one way to not have like hip development
Mhm.
and breast development, right? So, that's another, like, do we find another way? Because,
Yeah.
there are other ways. So do we look at those, or, yeah, do we continue
Yeah.
to look at starvation as a way to, quote, solve what's going on here?
And do you ever, like, is that something that you ever end up I mean, not starvation necessarily, but like, do you ever support a client in a marginalized body, like going down the path of trying to pursue weight loss?
No, I see that there are people out there who will do it, because there are. Like, you can, just
Yeah.
like throw a rock and find a, dietitian, a
Yeah.
coach, or whomever that will support people in weight loss. And yeah, that's not me. And that's okay.
Yeah. So you'll just be like, find someone to
Yeah.
take you on this path because that's not me.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
fair. So one thing that I feel like is different across the eating disorders is, like, I know that this stigma and bias shows up everywhere, but particularly around the word anorexia, just because of the like imagery I think that we were given, like in the
Hmm.
last couple of decades anyway, around what that looks like. And that I find that people in larger bodies are the least likely to notice that they have anorexia or seek help or be believed or any of these things, access treatment, because that one in particular we imagine has to be emaciated, and
Hmm.
also because the literal DSM-5
Yeah.
tells us that in order to be diagnosed, you have to be, I forget what it is, but there's a weight component to it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Atypical, quote, atypical anorexia, for everybody who's not, quote, underweight, is way
Mhm.
more typical.
Yeah.
And, when, larger folks go to the doctor and, are asked what they're eating and it's basically nothing, they're given praise for that again, or weight loss, they're given praise and they're not assessed for an eating disorder. And what
Yeah.
like doctors will recommend, to be, quote, healthier or to lose weight, it's 5 to 10% body weight loss, for
Mhm.
whatever it is. But if we're looking at the research of like what oftentimes can, atypical anorexia can look like, it is that 5 to 10%, body weight loss in a certain period of time. So
Mm.
yeah.
I feel like this is one of those things that just makes me want to bang my head against a wall. And I know you obviously have gone through it so many times, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts if you want to give a little insight into where this came from and where you think or hope it's going in this eating disorder treatment field around weight bias and stigma and just, yeah, like the history and also where you hope it goes.
I think, well, what's made pretty clear, the eating disorder field is really like grounded in psychiatry and medicine, especially white men, um, who were, pretty invested in, the thin white woman, like as frail, as in need of tending.
Yeah.
And so really wanting to do, support, women and girls, who are afraid of being fat, basically who are a
Yeah.
size, I don't know, like 4 when they're afraid of being a size 8,
Hmm.
just really supporting them to get that way. Um, and so, when your diagnosis and when your field is so invested in people who are afraid of becoming fat, like how do you let in people who are actually fat, right? You can't, and really
Hmm.
like have the same values, because people who are fat are not afraid of being, fat just because, they are. And it's this, people are afraid of fat phobia. It's not necessarily being fat, right? So people can feel
Yeah.
fine about, their weight if, they're at the higher end of the weight spectrum. But if people are trash, like they want to lose weight oftentimes.
Yeah.
So yeah, like letting people who are, quote, average or larger into like team anorexia just doesn't fit with like the
Right.
frail, like in need of tending, white girl or white woman that people just really want to rally around.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you define fat phobia for us here?
Oh, sure. It's just, so there's the structural ways and then there's anti-fatness. So there's like the individual bias, the ways that we've been taught to like view fat people, which is inherently like gluttonous, lazy. We assume, people are just sitting around and eating, quote, unhealthy food all the time and never exercising.
Yeah.
So because of those inherent biases, also people are not smart, we're told.
Yeah.
Yeah, lacking intelligence. So those are like the individual stuff that we've been told by society. Then there's like the structural fat phobia and anti-fatness and, clothing sizes, airplane seats,
Yeah.
lecture halls, stadium seating, and all of that stuff that comes out. But really looking and taking it back, like where did the gluttony like values or lack of, let's see, I'll say purity values come from? And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
yeah, right, it's religion, it's um Anglo-Saxon like values of
Yeah.
purity that just, inherently privilege those who are looking like they're abstaining rather than those who are, yeah, who
Hmm.
are eating food. But as we know, like your size doesn't have anything to do with what you're eating.
Yeah. Yeah. I have heard, well, so first of all, I just want to clarify there's two different aspects to fat phobia. One, you're saying is the perception, just like individual person to person perceptions, often subconscious, often conscious of like how we perceive a person based on their body size. The other one is systemic discrimination facing
Hmm.
people in larger body sizes.
Yeah.
And I often hear people who choose not to use the word fat phobia because it it isn't really a fear in the classic
Yeah.
phobia sense.
Mhm.
Similar to homophobia, I guess
Yeah.
it would be more like homo hatred, and fat hatred.
Mhm.
But do you use the term yourself, fat phobia?
I use it because my fat friends will use it a lot, and I don't
Mm,
want to discount their experience. So there are, fat folks who have said, I'm going to use anti-fatness
yeah.
rather than fat phobia because, either fat phobia is, thought to be ableist because it isn't an actual fear. But I've asked my
Mm,
friends who were, close to me, and they, have seen people like recoil at their
yeah, yeah, yeah,
existence. So they feel it's, well, I will say, like some feel that it is fat phobia. There's research that looks at people and everything that they would give up in order to not be fat. And it's like they would rather be, divorced, infertile.
yep,
They would, like to die earlier rather than be fat. And for that, for some people, that feels like
yeah,
a fear of being fat.
absolutely.
And I always reframe that to be, actually what they're afraid of is being treated like a fat person, who inherently and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, has anti-fat bias all the time. So
Yeah,
there's both. And I don't want to discount, what my friends experience and feel by
totally.
never using the term.
I feel like I've probably had a similar experience in terms of people's personal connection to the words, but I'll sort of flip back and forth with anti-fat bias and fat phobia. But yeah, so I don't know if you know how much or much about my work, but so body neutrality, the way I define it, is about stripping away the added or false or inflated moral significance, judgments, and meaning from the body, so that you can just see it clearly for what it is, which ultimately is not necessarily a neutral experience, because for people in marginalized bodies, you strip that away and you start to realize, okay, well, I did hate my body, or I was afraid of gaining weight because I thought it meant something about me. And now I realize I hate my body, or I'm afraid of gaining weight because of what you just said. Like, I'm afraid of how society will treat me. It's not exactly better insofar as you still have a huge problem and a whole
Mm,
lot of stuff to deal with in there. It's not
mhm.
like everything is solved, but it does take the blame and shame
Yeah.
out of it. So now you're
Mhm.
really looking at the actual situation, and your
Mhm.
anger and all of the feelings that come along with that can get aimed appropriately
Mhm.
towards the treatment that you are wanting to avoid or hating so much, rather than yourself.
Yeah. I always ask people to think of like their body is not the problem with how
Yeah.
they feel. Yeah. About, yeah, their body. It's not a problem. It's not a project to be,
Yeah.
solved. Yes. Society is where it's coming from. It's not you
Yeah.
for sure.
So that is a good bridge to this question I had. So on your website, you write, bodies are inherently political, especially those that don't conform to what society deems worthy and desirable. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that.
I think it's, assume perhaps for some folks with more desirability and social capital that, it's an assumption that your body, has anything to do with how you're treated. Or, if you just think yourself into positivity,
Mhm.
it'll be fine and great. But like, when we look at a person, it's impossible not to read
Mm.
something, either make assumptions or see something. So just existing is inherently political and we can't escape our body. So yeah, all of them mean something, regardless if it's something negative or something we associate positively. It's impossible to separate, our body and the political nature that we have.
Yeah. And do you think that's true for all bodies, or just for
Oh
folks in
yeah.
marginalized bodies? Yeah.
Oh yeah. We look at white folks and see, or assume that life has been, easier or class
Of
markers.
course.
Um, so yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Thin folks, we, naturally see like a life that has been more easeful when
Yeah.
navigating spaces. Like they have never had to wonder, or we have never had to wonder whether or not, they can find their like clothing size or like sit somewhere or
Yeah.
whatever it is. So yeah, on both ends for sure.
Yeah. I also, something I talk a lot with clients is sort of separating the part of this fear. One part is the valid thing that's true, which is, the discrimination that you would
Yeah.
have to face. And the
Mhm.
other thing is a made up narrative about how that thin person is probably happy and satisfied and living
Oh
this life
yeah.
that feels
Hmm.
amazing, right? Like, it is definitely associated with, like, if you have a privileged body, you will feel all the ways I want to feel. And that certainly isn't true. But do they face these same challenges? No.
Yeah. I mean, of course, people could have eating disorders, but so often people get positive praise
Yeah.
for weight loss after because they had cancer. Like, we just don't
Yeah,
know
absolutely.
what's going on for people.
Definitely. So you talk about how disrupting the dominant narrative about bodies is activism, and you talk about how just existing in a body is political. And it sounds to me like being visible is one
Mm,
of the sort of directions you take that work. Like you encourage people to be visible and own the fact that being visible, especially in a marginalized body, is an act of protest almost.
mhm.
Would you say that is? Am I reading that correctly?
The Let's see. I always think of folks who are marginalized. Oftentimes, they're both hyper visible and invisible. I think about
Hmm.
that for Black folks and also for fat folks who, we can't not see people, but oftentimes people are ignored. Or also, people in wheelchairs or who use
Yeah.
mobility devices. Yeah. So being hyper visible, but also invisible when it comes to like whether or not people will, make eye contact. So
Right.
I like, when we have to be visible, I like to reframe it as yes, an act of protest, like you just being and choosing to leave your house, like recognize that for the resistance and how hard it is for you to do that.
Yeah. What advice would you give to someone then in a marginalized body who's sort of struggling with all of this stuff and, wanting to adopt a different perspective on their body and wanting it to feel like part of this sort of resistance that you talk about? How do you tell them to go about that?
Yeah, I think knowing your body is not a problem, but also finding community because when you're like a singular individual trying to do this work, it's hard. And again, it's not individual work to be done. But if you're doing it in community with other
Yeah.
people, yeah, there's just a magic that happens there. So finding community is definitely something that I'm always looking at.
Yeah. And also, what if they were coming at you and wanting to like alter their perspective on health? Is there any advice that you go to, or is it always just this like questioning, challenging, unpacking?
Hmm. Other than the questioning, challenging, and unpacking, no, I guess it would still be some of the unpacking is, looking at healthism, which is like the idea that if you're not trying to be healthy, you're like not worthy or,
Yeah.
not on the correct like life path.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think unpacking that a bit more and, if quote being healthy, was let's see if eating olive oil, a vegan diet, or whatever it
Yeah.
was the way to be healthy, like people would not die of heart attacks or stroke or anything like that. If they were doing all the things right, they wouldn't die. And whoever the personal trainer on The Biggest Loser who ended up having a heart attack, like that would,
Yeah. Yeah.
should never have happened to him if he was exercising and eating well. But like that
Right.
is not true. So, like, yeah, it's just ridiculous out there.
Yeah. A lot of unpacking and challenging for sure. Okay, so I don't remember why I wrote this question down. I hope it was relevant to something, but I used to participate in the kind of like before I found body neutrality and like the path I'm on now, I would do a lot of like body positivity stuff back when that was a very particular look. The social media version of it that I've come to see as deeply problematic, particularly coming from people who look like me, which would be like showing pictures of my body's quote unquote flaws and talking about how I've learned to love or accept them. All kind of, I don't know that I necessarily said this, but definitely through the lens of like, and you can too.
Yeah.
And now, obviously, I'm a lot more aware of my own privilege and the fact that this kind of space needs way more representation of thin. Well, the last thing it needs rather is representation of thin, white, able-bodied folks. So I don't do it anymore, but I see it constantly still,
Mm.
especially on TikTok. And I'm curious what you make of these posts and your thoughts on it.
I mean, I think you've said it already. The people who've also like made their entire brands, like Rachel Hollis is one of them. I didn't realize that it was only from like posting her bikini body with like some stretch marks on her belly is like how she went from like quote nobody to being a gazillionaire and having like her an
Yeah.
own series of books. But Yes, it's ridiculous, but also shows just, how body positivity went from like fat activism to
Hmm.
something, that really again helps those who are closest already to having privilege. I
Yeah.
just tell people to unfollow or on TikTok,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
push the button, say I'm not interested in this content. Because yeah, people are, using the ideas of marginalized folks to increase their social capital for sure.
Yeah. And I would say that the social construction of capital H health you were talking about before, it like I feel like it plays into that, maybe not exactly around health, but it plays into that same idea of like making it the like really reinforcing the connection between bodies that look a certain way and happiness and health and all
Mhm.
that stuff as well. Even if it's unintentional, it's still there. And I unfollow or on TikTok, I'm recently on TikTok, so I'm still exploring it. But I do the thing where I mark it as uninterested or whatever constantly, and
Yeah.
it's still flooding my feed. It drives me nuts.
I find that with dietitian content
Yeah.
as well, because I have a few friends who are dietitians and I follow them, but then it just wants to show me every dietitian out there, and I'm like, no, I don't want this content at all. Weird weight loss stuff, yeah, very
Yeah.
relatable.
So I know you do consultation work around centering the most marginalized folks, and I'm curious to hear more about that for myself as well as for other like personal trainers, nutritionists, therapists, coaches, whoever who are listening. What does that mean? And what does that look like?
So I have hour-long appointments, and typically people, will bring a couple, cases or clients or consultation questions. And then we'll talk through them. And again, it's a lot of unpacking. I
Hmm.
always say I don't have the, answers because that's impossible. But how can people think through, their work with somebody in order to more affirm, that person and their reality. So it's not just like trying to brush things
Yeah.
under the rug. And oftentimes people will gaslight people's experience by telling them, no, 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 people love you just the way you are, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, and then what other resources can they, provide to that person type of stuff. So usually it is like consultation questions or like also personal development. Like Jessica, I
Mm,
heard you using like the word fat, on this podcast. I,
right.
need to unpack a lot of my internalized fat phobia or anti-fatness. And then, yeah, just walk
Got
through
it.
that as well.
Oh, that's super interesting. I also know that you're really passionate about adopting fat activism and anti-racism as core values and encouraging people to seek out fat positive or like dietitians of color.
Yeah.
So, in your experience, why would you say that is so important for people, and what changes when they do?
So if I am asking people to like find a therapist or, I left UC Davis and people are going to ask, find other dietitians. When people are able to, say fatness without flinching, it gives you an idea of their body politic already. And,
Mm,
whether it doesn't say whether or not somebody's anti-fat or not, but at least they're able to have conversations and they've thought through things. And the same with the connection of racism, white supremacy, and capitalism. Like these are questions that I want, people to be able to, assess in their providers and their trainers and their coaches, because without, those understandings, like their reality won't really be validated, or also people won't be stretched to grow. So even if it's, for folks who are thin and white, like there's still like societal context. So, it's not just for marginalized people being seen, it's for all of us, really doing this work
yeah,
together.
absolutely. Okay, so you have a new book coming out. How cool is that?
Yeah.
I have a book coming out in June, so I'm like very
Oh.
excited about all of this, and seeing the new wave of books that are coming out this year is
Mhm.
making me very happy.
Mhm.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what it's about?
Sure. In the first, let's see. Well, actually, there's the intro where I, bring in more client stories and also really discuss like that I can't do a lot of quote evidence-based, um, research because marginalized people are just not in research. So,
Mm,
everything in this book
yeah,
is going to
interesting.
be, my experience, my clients' experience, my friends,
Yeah.
inherently. And then, the first like actual section is like the actual problems that we're facing, particularly as Black women, who are really centered in the book. It's like the resilience that we're supposed to have, the restriction, making ourselves smaller,
Mm,
respectability, amongst ourselves, but how all these things are really, trying to keep us safe
yeah.
in, the US. And then it's like the supposed solutions, which are body positivity, which of course doesn't cure anything. Health, just being
Yeah.
healthy will make us better. Intuitive eating, which I can, talk for a while about.
Yeah.
And then wellness, is supposed to be this panacea of, but
Hmm.
like none of it is actually addressing any of the issues. And then the third section just talks about joy and, coming back to ourselves and seeing that, and then centering that versus, all the other stuff that folks attribute to Black women, like our ability to like labor and work and overwork ourselves. So how can we center joy? And so it's a very conversational book because, folks who read Fearing the Black Body, which I highly recommend. It's
Good.
400 pages and 400 years of, really hard things. And I really wanted this to be a book that people were able to get to the
Mm,
end. I pick up nonfiction all the time, I'll start it or I'll skip around. But yeah, so this book
yeah.
is fun. I really want people to, enjoy it and be able to finish it.
I love that. For anybody listening, Sabrina Strings is the author of Fearing the Black Body. It is a great book. It is a long book. It is an in-depth look at the history of racism and fat phobia intersecting. I think it's really important. And I also fully recognize that if you're in the mood for like a chill liberation book, it is it is not chill. I love that you're doing it conversationally. I also think this idea of, you said that Black women's ability to weaponize joy and build community is so healing. And first
Mhm.
of all, just the phrase weaponized joy makes me very happy. I think that's incredible. And second of all, the idea that joy can be a part of this like movement towards liberation, both individually and socially, is so powerful.
It was, I was not the first person to say that.
Sure,
Actually,
yeah.
I talked about, joy as resistance, as rebellion. And, my friend Shayna,
Same.
who happens to be on the cover of the book, said that I really talk about it more as like a weapon in a society that is, constantly trying to strip us, of joy, of our humanity, and how, in
Mm,
community we're able to come together and, weaponize
yeah.
joy for our, sanity, community, and ourselves.
Yeah. I freaking love that. I love that. It's such a beautiful sentiment. It's so true. It's so powerful. And it's also just not how people generally think about liberation. Like we think
Yeah.
about it as being this, and it is obviously super dark, super heavy,
Mhm.
like a slog to a finish line that's never going to come.
Yeah.
But this is just so powerful of a thought that, especially seeing marginalized folks centering joy, that in and of itself flips the whole script,
Yeah.
and they deserve it, right?
Mhm.
Like it's also just their birthright. So the fact that it gets to be both this sort of coming home and resistance against the culture is so amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else you want to share about the book, or anything else coming to mind that we haven't talked about or haven't asked about yet?
No, I think we did a great general overview. I would say that if folks, the book is and has been important for clinicians, for coaches and trainers. So even though, Black women are centered, if folks are, have anyone in their life who, has an eating disorder or
Yeah.
struggles with body stuff and people want to support them, I've gotten great feedback from, clinicians and coaches. And then
Amazing.
anybody who's experienced an eating disorder who hasn't been seen, I've gotten great feedback from, those folks as well. And it's an
Awesome.
audiobook. I read it, I laugh at myself in it. So that's what I would
Nice.
say about the book.
That's so great. Amazing. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here and getting to talk to you about this stuff. You want to tell people where they can find you if they want to learn more about you?
Sure. So Instagram is at jessicawilson.msrd. Twitter, if it exists, is Jessica Wilson RD. Who knows? And then I have a teeny tiny following on TikTok. And it's by Jessica Wilson. So we'll see if that goes anywhere. We're just messing around right now.
Same. I get that. All right. Well, amazing to have you, and everyone listening, you know where to find me at jessinealon.com, at jessinealon on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, probably Facebook. I don't know. And yeah, thank you for listening, and I will catch you next week.